We call it the Meeker Incident, as referred to in books as a massacre. They were fully capable of killing everyone at both sites, but backed off. And so it can't be a massacre, and for that reason I call it the Meeker Incident. Now that happened just a few miles from here in the White River area, and happened largely because of an agent, Meeker, who was assigned to that, who was an agrarian who had established Meeker, or not Meeker, but Greeley, Colorado, and became indebted to Mr. Greeley, and in order to get out of debt, accepted a position as the Indian agent in Meeker. But his ideas immediately clashed with the Utes, who had forever been a nomadic people who followed the animals, their herds of deer and elk throughout this area, the Yampa Utes. And when he brought his ideas to the Utes to civilize them, he did it in a very harsh way, also using as an instrument hunger and withholding issues that should have gone to them throughout the winter months and other times. The biggest issue being forcing upon the Utes a way of life that they didn't understand. Boundaries to the Utes held no meaning. For centuries and ages they had been able to move across this land without hindrance. Now how come is it that a white man can come in, the agent can strike a line across the mountains, but you can't see that line, but you're told to stay within that, but you can't go out, but everybody else can? The encroachment came across. Deers and animals could go across it, but the Indian couldn't. And yet there was nothing physical to hold him in. And then also owning land. He told them when he moved the agency from its original location down to the Powell Park, he immediately started laying out town site, streets and alleys that he knew about. The Indian knew nothing about that. And so then he instructed them to build cabins upon these lots, and that the army would help do that. The Indian ponies were small, and so he promised that he would bring in larger animals to bring in logs, and so that they could build these log cabins. And he did convince them to do that, because some Indians did start to move on those lots. But then again, he changed his mind and decided that the whole valley bottom should be cultivated. And so he started to develop and plow up those same lands that he had promised them to build on. And in fact, he told them that if they relocated, the army would do it for them. And so immediately that began to be a conflict. And that conflict became enormous, too much, in fact, that they became physical with one another. A tribal leader pushed him around and tried to get his way with him, and told him not to do this because it doesn't make sense to us. Don't do this to the land, this land that we hold sacred, this land that's Mother Earth. Don't rip into Mother Earth. This is where our ponies graze, and you're plowing it all up. It doesn't make sense to us. Even though they didn't say it in those words, that's what they meant to say to him. But he was persistent in wanting to do that. This resulted in him being physically pushed around, which enabled him to call forces in. And once he did that, the motion started. For once, the government listened to him in doing something, and they started to send troops in to help him keep peace. Now, the Utes are not regimented. They're not trained in any manner They didn't have captains, they didn't have sergeants, they didn't have all of these things that the Army had. The one thing they did have was better rifles than the Army. The Army had Army-issued rifles, which were what? The cheapest that the Army could get. But the Utes had arms that they purchased locally at the local outposts. And so they were better armed, but they had no know-how on how to go about fighting this army that was going to come in. Previous to that, they also knew about Sand Creek, what happened at Sand Creek. And this is one of the things that Meeker would tell them, is that if you don't do as I wish, the Army will come in and shackle you and take you to Oklahoma, or they will put you in jail and you will be tortured. And so with that in their minds, and then actually seeing the Army coming in, they went out and asked twice. They visited the Army camp on their way in and asked them not to go in because the reservation boundary had been set. And if they crossed that boundary, it would be an act of war. And so that was not taken by the Thornburg. Thornburg resisted that and stated that he had his orders and that he was to go in and he would follow orders. And so he commenced his march. And when they came upon the line, then, to make a long story short, they met, and that's where the battle began. Now the Utes, they had no idea why this had to be, simply because a man wanted to rip into Mother Earth and that they had to stay on their side of the line. They had no idea of implications that this all was for, and they just fought to defend a way of life. That's as simple as I can put it, because they had no idea of all of the political ramifications, of all of the ramifications that would follow as a result of all of this. They simply did what they felt was right and to protect the way of life. And so, as a result of that, the U.S. government decided that they had breached the contract, breached the treaty that Chief Ouray had put together. And so then they must be dealt with. And so there was two options. One was to remove the Utes entirely, and the other was extermination. So the government beefed up the forts that were located, the agents, and at Fort Steele in Wyoming, Fort Garland, and Fort Lewis. They were beefed up with more armies that came in to take care of the Utes. And Chief Ouray, decided that he needed to step in and take care of this issue and defuse this whole thing. And a series of meetings went on about bringing in those guilty parties that had murdered or killed the agent personnel. The fight was decided that was a fair battle, but they still wanted the people that at the agency that had done the killing. And Chief Ouray decided, to make a long story short, that the only way that they could do that was to go to Washington and try them there. And this did not happen. Douglas was the only one that was jailed for a year and released. Results of that was that Ouray and a delegation went to Washington and signed a treaty to remove the White Rivers and the Uncompahgres from the locations. The Southern Utes remain where they are, along with the Mountain Utes. In 1881, when that was to be signed, in 1880, Chief Ouray traveled to the Southern Ute Agency where they were assembled to sign those treaties, and he passed away when he got there. So he was buried in the rocks near Ignacio. Chipeta came back to Montrose, to their ranch, and 6 days after that, the Utes requested that his Chief Ouray's remains be brought back to Montrose. This was not done. It was promised to be done, but it didn't happen. So in 1881, they removed the Uncompahgre's. First, it was to where Grand Junction is today, but it had to be assessed to see if it had enough water for subsistence of the Utes. And the person that made that assessment came back and said that it would not carry the Utes, and that they needed to move to Utah, onto the Uinta Reservation. Because the wording of that agreement was that if the Grand Junction area was not inhabitable by the Utes, then adjacent lands could be had. And adjacent lands in this case was into Utah. That's quite a stretch of adjacent. And the White Rivers were removed from the White River area and joined the Uinta Utes. They were included in the reservation with the already existing Uinta Reservation. The Uncompahgre's were put on a new reservation adjacent to the Uinta Reservation, known as the Ouray Reservation, named after Chief Ouray. So those two reservations became the Uinta and Ouray Reservation in 1934. And the Indian Reorganization Act came, doing away with tribal leaders as chiefs and setting up a government, much like any city government. And that's where we are today. We have our own government and the Uinta and Ouray Agency. Duvup means ground or dirt. If I was to say, this is my land, I would have to say, Nunai Duvup, which really doesn't fit that. It just, I can only say my dirt, my Duvup is ground, my ground, but it has no real ownership to me. So that's as good as you can describe the land and that I use it, but that's as close as I could get to it.